And what I would like to do to begin with is that I think a very important or a very fundamental aspect that we need to have in place in order to deal with a lot of these challenges is to look at this question of what is a worldview? Because really at the bottom of it, so many things we look around us, and we as Muslims today, we live in a world that is not of our own making, as it has been said. Of course, from the time of Islam, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims spread very rapidly and basically came to occupy much of the known world of the time. And for the following 1,000 years, Islamic civilization was dominant, as we all know, in material, political, and economic terms, as well as, of course, spiritual terms, which is the most important. But there is no major world civilization that did not border the Islamic civilization and that was not deeply impacted by it, not least of them being Europe itself. Over the last several hundred years, however, there has been a radical shift of the balance of power in the world, where the Muslim world and all other areas outside of Europe/America, has basically retreated in at least a worldly sense and come to occupy a subordinate or peripheral position, with modern Europe rising as of, say, the 16th, but particularly the 17th century, to a place of prominence, which ushered in the first kind of truly global world system in which the entire globe was now and is now still incorporated into one paradigm. This paradigm is not of our making. The world would look very different if it were, but it is a paradigm that is based on a European model, which starts out as a Christian model, but then secularizes as we move into the modern period. And this worldview, this way of looking at the world, is pervasive now, especially for us living here in the West, but increasingly over the globe, because there really is no East and West anymore, especially after the rise of the internet, even before, but especially after the rise of modern methods of communication. Everybody is everywhere and everything is all over the place. You can be in Jakarta, you can be in Riyadh, you can be in anywhere you want, and you have access to the same sort of cultural products, the same entertainment, the same ideas. Very often your schooling is based on a Western model. You live in a modern nation state also based on a European model. So how do we get to, so obviously for many of us Muslims today, we feel a great sort of tension within our souls. And so we feel that obviously there are conflicts. Islam says one thing, but the world around us says something else. We believe this is true, they say it's false. We believe this is false, they say it's true, and so forth, so on and so forth. And we often don't know how to deal with this tension. So my contention is that a very effective way to do it is to take a step back and look at the overall paradigm from afar, and to, first of all, conceptualize what is this thing called a worldview. So basically a worldview, I would say everybody has a worldview, and a worldview, well, all right, so what is a worldview? I mean, here you have this picture of someone looking at a globe. Obviously, we're not talking about it in terms of a physical worldview, but we're talking about a conceptual frame of reference through which one interprets the world. As we said, in the modern age, especially for many of us Muslims, we feel that there is sort of a tug of war going on. We grow up with Islam, but we also grow up in the midst of this paradigm, which is based on something a very different set of assumptions and process of viewing the world. And so we feel there's a tug of war between us and them, East and West, Islam and America and Europe and so forth. And this often leads to people talking past each other, people arguing, people getting into conflict. Of course, Samuel Huntington's famous, Clash of Civilizations thesis is one manifestation of this. But whether one endorses the thesis or not, clearly there is a lot of, mutual recriminations, we could say, that take place on both sides or all sides of the current world situation. So often we don't know how it is that we should communicate with other people. How can we make Islam known to other people? How can we make it comprehensible to other people as a very minimal first step? Because in fact, we are sent to make da'wah. We are actually supposed to call people to Islam. And we're having trouble nowadays even making Islam sort of understandable and minimally plausible to people, let alone calling them to it, right? So this raises a great challenge in the way we communicate with others. But also, and this is even more fundamental, we often feel a confusion within ourselves. There is no person who has grown up, I would surmise, in the modern world, Muslim who has grown up in the modern world, who has not had some very basic questions about, wait a minute, how could this be true? There are certain things in the modern way of looking at things that conflict radically and fundamentally with Islam, and vice versa, right? And because we're exposed to both of these paradigms, half the time we're thinking with one hat and half the time we're thinking with another. And when these two conflict and clash with each other, very often it can lead to a profound sense of malaz for us internally. And it can even lead to, the sort of rankling in the heart, a disquietude of the soul. And also it can lead to actual questioning of the faith, questioning of our commitments, questioning of our belief. According to some surveys, I believe a Pew survey, and I don't know, how accurate it is, but it is estimated that up to 25% of born Muslims end up leaving the faith in the West. Now, maybe many of these people grew up in very secularized families to begin with and never really had more than a kind of loose cultural attachment to Islam, Allahu A'lam. But we tend to look, when we talk about, for example, the number of Muslims in America, how are we counting that number? We're counting it by the number of sort of born Muslims from like a Muslim background with Muslim names. And so that is kind of how we, judge our numbers. And probably if you take it from an actual belief angle, you would have to cut out a lot of those people. And if it's true that 25% are leaving, that's really quite startling. We often say Islam is the fastest growing religion in America, but according to these statistics, Islam is actually not growing at all. It's still doing better than other religions, however, because other religions are bleeding and hemorrhaging and losing members without replacing them. Whereas Islam, because there are quite a substantial number of converts, it seems that we're at least replacing, people who leave out the back door. You have new converts coming in to replace them. So Allahu A'lam, but it seems like we are holding our numbers, but probably not increasing at the current time. Anyway, numbers is not what it's all about. That's part of the sort of reign of quantity that's very characteristic of modernity that we don't actually want to adopt. And so quality is always more important than quantity. But nevertheless, you can see my point that many of us, people leave Islam because they find it not plausible or not ethical or not reasonable, given the paradigm which is presented to them as the default. And so this is what we want to start to get to the bottom of. So what is a worldview? I've used this word several times now. And so let's talk a little bit more about what a worldview is. So here's a definition that I found on the internet. It's as good as any other. So I'll read this. A person's worldview represents his most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe he inhabits. It reflects how he would answer all the big questions of human existence. Fundamental questions about who and what we are, where we came from, why we're here, where, if anywhere, we're headed, the meaning and purpose of life, the nature of the afterlife, if there is such a thing, and what counts as a good life here and now. Okay, so all of the major questions of existence that thinking people have always asked themselves. Few people think through these issues in any depth, which is a problem for us, and fewer still have firm answers to such questions. But a person's worldview will at least incline him towards certain kinds of answers and away from others. Okay, so worldview is sort of a comprehensive, it's the sum total of all of the fundamental assumptions that you hold about the world. What exists, what doesn't exist? What does it mean when someone says, we know that X, Y, and Z is the case? What does it mean to know? What are the sources of knowledge? How can you establish something as an element of knowledge as opposed to just subjective belief, for example, right? What is a human being? How should one act? Is there a purpose to life, either the sort of existence of the universe or my personal existence as a human being? Or are these things, is there no objective purpose and I'm left to sort of create and project my own purpose onto the world and so forth? So all of these come together and form the worldview. And as the person here, this was actually taken from a Christian website, states, most people are very unaware of their worldview. It is something that lies very, very deep within a person's psyche. It is acquired from the environment very much in the way a language is. And your worldview is the paradigm through which you think and through which you view the world. And therefore, it's very difficult to see it if you've not been trained to look at it and identify what its constituent parts are. It's like when you put glasses on, you see through the glasses, you don't see the glasses, right? And so most people utterly take their worldview for granted. just like if you grow up, especially in a monolingual environment, and you grow up just speaking one language, then you take your native language utterly for granted. Of course, all children acquire their native language or languages in a non-reflective, completely natural manner. And you open your mouth, and if you grow up in America, you open your mouth and English comes out. Like, that's just what happens. And it can be very difficult to sort of see the structure of your native language until you actually sit down and are told, wait a minute, language has components. There are nouns and verbs and adjectives, and here's how they interact. And especially when you now learn a second language, and then you see not all languages operate the same way. In English, for example, we put the adjective before the noun. I'm wearing a blue shirt. In Arabic and the Latin languages, many others, it's the other way around. I'm wearing a shirt blue, right? And so when you are exposed to another language, you say, oh, well, wait a minute, I didn't realize there was another way to do this, right? There are some basic sort of universal probably categories that exist presumably in all languages, like a category of nouns by which you denote substantive things, words by which you denote qualities of those things. In English, we would call those adjectives, verbs, so words that denote actions rather than things, and so forth. Presumably, these kind of generic categories would exist across all human languages because all human beings need to express these different generic categories of meanings, but the way each language works is very specific to that language. And again, it's not really until you are exposed to another language that you can start to see that languages are actually relative, and they're not just to be taken for granted. And I think when it comes to worldviews, it's very much the same thing. If you grow up in a unified, I don't know if anybody does anymore particularly, but if you grow up in a relatively unified worldview, you will simply adopt notions about the world, notions about truth, notions about reality, notions about value and meaning that you will simply acquire and reproduce totally automatically without even thinking that there's possibly another way that the world can be seen or interpreted, or that something other than what you already believe could actually be true. Of course, as Muslims, because we do exist sort of very consciously between two worldviews, we are probably more aware of what a worldview is, at least in terms of the effects it leaves on our hearts, as I said, than a lot of other people in modern society for whom there really is no contender. There is no serious kind of Christian worldview, except for, there are obviously some people who still hold to that, but for a great many number of people in the modern world, the past kind of religious worldview is over. It's a thing of the past, and everyone is essentially a modern person. And we'll talk about what that means. And there really is no other paradigm outside of which to think or with which to compare or evaluate the modern paradigm. I think as Muslims, we have a unique position because we very consciously adhere to a paradigm that is different, has different roots and assumptions than the modern, sort of secular worldview, again, that comes out of a secularizing Europe. And because we are still, by and large, clinging onto that, we are aware of the differences. It's like also, again, the analogy with language is very apt here. Many Muslims are at least bilingual, if not trilingual. Many people in the United States and in Western Europe are, say, second-generation Muslims. They often speak, obviously, the dominant language of their society, as well as a home language, Urdu, Arabic, whatever Turkish language it might be. And so, most Muslims are aware that, okay, there are different ways of talking, there are different ways that languages can describe reality, because they have at least two languages, and they can see that they don't really say things the same way, right? They don't also conceptualize the world the same way either. And so when it comes to worldview, it's the same for us. Now, to push the linguistic example a little bit further, if I may, as probably most of you know, if you are bilingual or grew up, in a family with parents who came from elsewhere to the United States or Europe, you will know that the two languages are often in your mind are not equal. Right, most people growing up, especially in the United States, are not what they would call balanced bilinguals. They are obviously dominant in one language, usually the ambient language of society, in our case English, and the home language is sort of L2, language 2. It's a second language, and the mastery of it obviously is less, and it's not the parents' mastery who grew up in the home country. Often there's also a lot of code switching in immigrant families, which means that even the parents, after decade or two who grew up native in whatever language from back home. They've lived in the US so long, the whole life around us goes on in English. So when they speak, they start mixing a lot of English in, half Urdu, half English, half Arabic, Haranzia or whatever, English Arabic type thing. When it comes to languages, just, you can have whatever attitude you want about language purity and whether it's desirable or not to mix codes like that. But in the end of the day, language, to at least a substantial degree, is a practical tool of communication. And there isn't a question of, there's no moral value attached to it. You're not going to be held accountable by Allah, for example, on the Day of Judgment because you didn't speak a pure Urdu at home, or, you mixed Arabic with French or something like that, right? But when it comes to the worldview, many of us are doing the same thing. We're kind of code switching, a lot of code switching. So in certain aspects of our lives and in certain circumstances, we are very Muslim, particularly in a masjid. We think Islamically. We kind of say the right things and sort of, conceive of the world, presumably in a way that's, in line with Islamic teachings. But then when we go out or we're in another setting, we often don't realize it, but we slip into a very different set of assumptions. We use a very different kind of language, and we often appeal to a very different set of foundational principles. And so there's kind of a, worldview code switching that goes on. And the reason this is more of a problem, as opposed to the language example, is that when it comes to the worldview, we're talking here about questions of truth. We're talking here about questions of reality. We're talking about questions of what is and is not. We're talking about questions of what's right and wrong, halal and haram, right? And these have obviously a direct bearing on our what kinds of people we are in this world, and also on our ultimate destiny in the hereafter. So it's actually quite dangerous if our worldview starts getting mixed up and we start code switching carelessly and come out with a mishmash, right? And then the other thing that's even more dangerous about that is that just like in language, this type of code switching doesn't really last very long. In most immigrant families, you will find that the first generation has some command of the home language, but by the second generation, i.e. the immigrant people's grandchildren, and certainly great-grandchildren, almost always the home language is completely gone by that time, and only the dominant language remains. And so it's only English and no Urdu, no Arabic, no home language, right? Again, that's sort of a natural language assimilation that takes place. The problem is if this happens with our worldview, the analogy would be second generation believes much in Islam, maybe kind of modernized a bit, Americanized a bit. The next generation, it's much more Americanized, modernized, secularized, and we'll talk more about this, with a more tenuous, connection to actual normative Islamic beliefs and teachings. By the third or fourth generation, what's going to be left, right? So because you're code switching and mixing and matching, right, ultimately one dominates, and just like English will dominate linguistically, also the ambient worldview will, if we're not aware of what's going on, can easily come to dominate without us actually knowing that it's going on. Okay, so let me move on. So just a few more and we'll go quickly. Worldviews shape and inform our experiences of the world around us. Like spectacles with colored lenses, they affect what we see and how we see it. Depending on the color of the lenses, some things may be seen more easily, or conversely, they may be de-emphasized or distorted. Indeed, some things may not be seen at all. Worldviews also largely determine people's opinions on matters of ethics and politics. What a person thinks about abortion, euthanasia, same-sex relationships, environmental ethics, economic policy, public education, and so on will depend on his underlying worldview more than anything else. Again, most people don't articulate it in this way, and you'll see many people fight about these issues, abortion and this and that, all of these other things, and they don't realize that, in fact, the opinions that they're holding are really the logical entailments of very deep-lying assumptions, foundational assumptions that are by and large unexamined by most people. And because they're unexamined, people don't really know how to navigate either their conflicts between themselves and others, or again, the conflicts within themselves, right? Where you're hearing one thing from one side, another thing from another side, and you don't know how to navigate the rupture. So as such, worldviews play a central and defining role in our lives. They shape what we believe and what we're willing to believe, how we interpret our experiences, how we behave in response to those experiences, and how we relate to others. our thoughts and our actions are conditioned by our worldviews, right? So we actually are impacted much more than we think by our worldview, and that's why it behooves us really to kind of grasp what a worldview is, and then what our worldview is as Muslims, what the surrounding dominant worldview of our age is, which is kind of the modern secular paradigm, and then to see in what ways these overlap, in what ways they diverge from each other, and what are the implications of that overlap and quite often that divergence. And again, how can we sort of navigate those gaps?
So diving straight into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gave people this little background, gave them a sense of this conversation that you and I had that I found absolutely vivifying and uplifting. And it just connected a lot of dots for me that previously existed as kind of these atomistic points of reflection floating in space. And you were able to link them to the issue of worldview, right? Worldview. Our students, particularly those studying at, reputed, respected institutions of learning, they are being surreptitiously indoctrinated into a certain worldview. And the worldview, that Muslims, had, for centuries seems to be, something that we have a very difficult time accessing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I've been talking for quite some time with youth in the Boston area and more recently online about this whole notion of a worldview. And I have an online lecture which people can refer to if they want to hear more about this topic with slides and so forth. But just to give a brief summary, I say, what is a worldview? A worldview is basically the sum set of assumptions that you hold to be true about the world. So just like every human being has language, at least one language, it's part of our human nature to be able to speak language, to have that linguistic capacity. Everyone has at least one language, if not more, as a native language. Similarly, everyone has a worldview. So when you look out on the world, you're not just seeing objectively what's there, you're actually looking at it through a particular prism, like a particular set of lenses. And I say, this is not an exhaustive list, but we can think of a worldview as consisting of several different categories of assumptions. And so to use kind of fancy terminology, philosophical terminology, first of all, there's an ontology involved. So ontology, what exists, right? Every person has some notion of, okay, I exist, the tree outside my window exists, so material things exist. What about non-material realities, right? Does a soul exist? Is it different from just brain function? Does God exist, right? That's a question of theology, but even more primarily, it's a question of ontology, right? What exists? And then there's a question of epistemology. What is knowledge? And how do humans know? And what are the sources of knowledge? And then there's a question of anthropology. What is man? What are we as human beings? Where do we come from? Where are we going, if anywhere? What is our purpose, or telos, or teleology, which is another kind of bucket that you would fill? Do we as human beings have an intrinsic purpose? Does the universe, the existence of the universe, have a purpose? Or is it just there as a brute fact? And are we just here as brute facts? And it's for each individual among us to sort of, impose our own meaning on the world, right? Which is obviously the kind of the modern view, right? Nothing's written. You just sort of generate your own meaning, your own purpose, and you kind of project it out. And then there's a question of morality and ethics. What is right and wrong? How ought we to act? What is the nature of morality? Right? So that's kind of moral ontology. Then what are the sources of moral knowledge? How do we know what's right and wrong? Is it through reason? Can we derive ethics, strictly through reason? Is it taken from our society? Revelation for us as Muslims would obviously be prime here, as it is with the other things. And then a question of law and politics. Where does valid law come from? Law that can sort of justly be implemented in a society. What are the bases of that? And then aesthetics. What is it that a culture finds beautiful? I think that also, art, you look at the art of any civilization, it tells you a lot about the heart and soul of the civilization that produced such objects of art, or that sees such things as being beautiful. So this is not an exhaustive list. You can talk about economic relationships, how different peoples view things like money, commodities, and so forth. So we can multiply these categories. But my contention is that just like everyone, when you open your mouth, some language comes out. Similarly, when you open your eyes, you're looking at the world through a very particular set of lenses. Now, why is this important for us as Muslims? Because as Muslims today, we are negotiating essentially two very distinct worldviews, right? Meaning this whole set of assumptions. So as Muslims, obviously, we are committed to Islam as a worldview. So our, how we would answer all of these questions about ontology, epistemology, anthropology, teleology, morality and ethics, law and politics, aesthetics, and so on and so forth. Islam has very specific things to say about these things, right? It answers these questions in a very specific manner. And the other worldview that we're kind of negotiating, because it's the currently dominant paradigm, is, you could call it many different things, but let's just call it for now the modern Western worldview, which in all its diversity does share certain basic features and characteristics, one of which is a turn towards materialism, one of which is a turn towards scientism, a rejection of religion as a kind of comprehensive worldview, right? Modernity very consciously kind of replaces religion as a worldview. You can be religious in the modern world, but the modern world itself is not a religious project anymore, right? No. So as Muslims, we are negotiating these two worldviews. Now, what happens a lot is that questions come up, doubts come up, even doubts, right? Well, we say or do or should say or do X as a Muslim, but everyone around us is doing or saying something else, and these two clash, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we don't know how to explain ourselves as Muslims to others, and sometimes we don't know how to explain Islam to others, and also at times we don't even know how to explain Islam to ourselves or understand it, and we fall into doubts. Sometimes this leads to people leaving the faith altogether or reinterpreting it in radically, novel ways and so forth that are not well grounded. And my contention is that many, many, many of these issues, these clashes that come up, really they're really surface manifestations of principial differences that are taking place way beyond the surface at the level of the roots of the worldview.
And this is the thing. I'm with you. The only thing is that much of your worldview is communicated to you by the society around you.
Absolutely. Just like language. I think
the analogy with language is quite fitting, because someone might be able to speak English with great facility, but not know anything about, second, third, participles, verbs, nouns, subjects, predicates. It's just a language that I'm able to speak because I have absorbed.
Intuitive. Yep.
Right, it's intuitive. I've absorbed language from my surrounding. So is there any way? Yes. One thing you said in your lecture, which in preparation for today's conversation, I did listen to your lecture, and I found it quite enlightening. But we'll often go into those secondary or even tertiary issues where we're talking about some issue of law and ethics, or some issue of economics and politics, or even some issue of aesthetics, without recognizing all of the different assumptions, the musallamat, right? The assumptions that play a part in arriving at a particular conclusion.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I don't want to sound impatient or worse yet, defeatist, but is there a way that we can cultivate some kind of, sense of a normative Islamic worldview while being in a world that is not of our own making?
So I think that we can do it, but it has to be done consciously in a way that it might not have to be done if we were living in an environment that was more dominated by Islam as a worldview, or where the Islamic worldview was dominant. So what do I mean by that? So you gave also a very good analogy of language, which I've also used. If you only know one language particularly, like if you grow up in the United States and you're monolingual, which probably most Muslims are not, because many are from immigrant backgrounds and have at least passive bilingualism in a second language. But say you grew up monolingual, as I did actually, you open your mouth and just English comes out. And you don't think about the structure of your language because it just comes to you intuitively, right? It's the tool you use to speak. You don't really reflect upon it. And it's not until you learn a foreign language. For example, I studied French first when I was 13, and I realized, okay, in English, we put the adjective before the noun. You say a blue shirt, but in French, you say une chemise bleue. It's a shirt blue, and in Arabic, you do the same, and Farsi, you would do the same. Okay, so then it's the first time you say, wait a minute, wow, I didn't realize that there was an issue here, that there was something called noun, adjective, word order, and that there's different ways to do this, right? The English being a Germanic language, okay, we put the adjective first, but other languages do it differently. And when you start learning another language, then you have to learn structures that are different from what you've taken for granted. Then you start to realize that, wait a minute, there are different ways of doing this. Not all languages treat the world the same way. They don't all process it the same way. And then when you learn a foreign language, you can actually have a more analytical and more conscious view of and appreciation of your own language. So in studying foreign languages, I learned a lot more about the structure of the English language, not practically speaking, because I'm a native speaker of English and that's never changed. But up here, I have a much more conscious, rational control of the structure of English, because I have other languages now with which to compare it and to understand, what's unique about it and where it shares with other languages in certain aspects. So I think a worldview is very much the same. Like, our problem is because we don't think in terms of worldview, we don't realize that this is a thing to think about. We just kind of come to the world, we grow up in the West, modern America, whatever it is, and we hear ideas and discourses and language is used. I mean, terminology is used and thrown around, and we just kind of, and it's normal, you just kind of repeat what you hear, and you also think in the categories that are presented to you. How could you do otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. And so so your native language becomes like the modern worldview, right? Just like if you grew up in America, your native language will be American English. However, as Muslims, we do have that other thing. So I think the fact that we're all like bilingual in the sense, like, so to me, the worldview is like the language of thought, right? If we want to push the linguistic analogy. So we're all bilingual in terms of our worldview. We're bi worldview.
So give me
what I think, just to finish that point, is that because we realize now that worldviews are not neutral, this is why I try now to kind of set it out explicitly and say, what are the explicit commitments of the Islamic worldview? What are the explicit entailments of La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah in all of those domains? And then what are the explicit assumptions of the modern worldview, which are just usually you breathe them in with the air because they're so dominant. Once you put a name on them and you start drawing them out and you compare them with the Islamic, now you can start to see where some of these, often substantial divergences come from, right? And once you get that mental control of it, I find that you can then really answer a lot of these questions. And in fact, a lot of these questions, they just sort of dissolve because you realize, well, wait a minute, I'm coming from a totally different set of commitments to begin with. And the only reason, the only different why Western modern, most people in the West might think this, or I might have thought this as a Muslim growing up here. The only reason I'm thinking that is because that's just a natural entailment of their premises, which are actually very different from my starting assumptions. And so because I know where I'm starting from and why, I don't need to, follow the entailments of another position that I don't even hold to begin with. But once you see that consciously, I think it's much easier, at least for me, and people I've taught, they've said, wow, this really helps us kind of, control for these issues and untie some of those knots in the heart. Actually, if I can use that last word just to respond to one thing you had said about what Dr. Jackson had said about, us really imbibing these structures of thought and worldview through the environment and through culture. That's absolutely correct. And I don't think that a purely intellectual, solution will fit the bill. However, so what does that mean? It means that we need alternative cultural spaces. We need alternative cultural production, right? So that we can sort of have an environment. And part of it is just surrounding yourself with good Muslims who make dhikr and pray to Allah. I mean, that's part of it, right? Because that's reinforcing a particular way of living, a particular way of thinking and looking at the world. So we need to be very pragmatic about it. Just like if you want your child to be fluent in a language, that child has to be, live in the environment of native speakers, right? And you have to, if you can't provide that environment, the language acquisition will not be complete. That's number one. Number two, however, is we have to make do with what we have. And we are all bombarded with this particular worldview, especially here in the West, right? And I think given that, it can still be very helpful, and it's an important first step to bring out these worldview issues explicitly, because once you learn to start seeing them, then you can start identifying them on your own, and you can start making the adjustments. Because I do think, what is Aqidah? Like the Prophet came, peace be upon him, he brought about a new way of life, a new way of living and doing it, but he also did bring about a new way of thinking. I mean, there's an Aqidah, which is a conceptual framework in looking at the world, which was brought in, which challenged and eventually replaced, or was meant to replace, the worldview and the assumptions and the conceptual framework of the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs and others to whom Islam comes. I mean, other human beings until the day of judgment, right? So there is a place for that. And I think if to go back, and we'll end with this, the language analogy, right? We speak the language, whether it's English or something like that, And there are mistakes that creep into it, and we take them for granted. Once you start learning explicit grammar, you say, wait a minute, actually that's wrong. You don't say him and I, he and I, right? They're both either both the subject or both the object. You can him and me, he and I, but you can't have him and I. Like, that's just wrong. I don't care how many people say it, like, it makes no sense. Once you learn that and you say, oh, okay, I have now you can correct that. And I think the worldview is the same. Well, I just assumed that freedom was like, everything was to be justified ultimately in terms of freedom and personal autonomy. I just assumed. Well, now guess what? That's not true. These are contentious philosophical assumptions which we actually don't accept. And once you realize that, you say, okay, well, wait a minute. I don't need to be bothered by alleged transgressions against personal autonomy that are bothering people, or I no longer need to justify Islam in terms of like, well, Islam is good because it maximizes personal autonomy. I mean, it doesn't do that necessarily, and it was never meant to. Like, why would we hold ourselves to that standard? So once you realize that, I think that can help bring about some of the very important kind of mental reprogram that's necessary, on the basis of which then we hope that we would go and create cultural spaces. But what kind of cultural spaces you're creating, right? Your cultural spaces will reflect your worldview. So it's kind of like not chicken and egg, but they feed into each other, right? I mean, your cultural space is not going to be right if your thinking is not right.
It's not just a clarion call for Muslim cultural creators, but it's a call for them to immerse themselves in a thoroughly Islamic worldview and then to create.
Yeah.
Right. So what we probably need to see is our novelists, our designers, our filmmakers, our storytellers, our playwrights sitting with our mashayikh. Right. We need those men and women sitting with those men and and what that synergy can produce will perhaps, really be worthwhile for our community.
And the very last thing too, I would say, I mean, a lot of my discourse, just the spaces that I operate in, is very kind of like intellectual and cerebral. And I've just talked about the importance of that, right? And I do think it is important. However, I think we would be making a very classically modern mistake, or stereotypically modern mistake, if we were to overstress the intellectual and not put stress on the lived and also the spiritual, right? I mean, the way we live, the way we are, our moral character affects the way we think and the way we look at the world too, right? We don't have this Cartesian mentality where just this disembodied, brain in a body. So part of resurrecting our worldview, protecting it, purifying it, is to purify our intentions, purify our actions, follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Building the worldview is living in a particular way, right? Because the way you live, the actions that you do, the way you lead your life, that affects you on a very profound level, including the prism through which you see the world, right? So this can never just be a philosophical endeavor, right? It has to be a thinking endeavor. Allah talks about, do they not reflect? يَتَدَبَّرُونَ يَعْقِلُونَ, right? يُفَكِّرُونَ. We have all of these words Allah is asking us to reflect, right? Ulul albab, Islam is sent for people of intellect, people of deep reflection, but at the same time, it's praxis and living in a particular kind of habitus and having a particular and cultivating a particular moral character, right? So part of building your worldview is praying your 5 daily prayers on time. Part of building your worldview is following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, eating with your right hand, washing yourself properly in the bathroom, all of these things, greeting people with salams. Some Muslims, hi, how are you? That's not sunnah. That affects your worldview. Salamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. That's part of the worldview, right? And your worldview is constructed by your concrete actions just as much as, if not more than, by, the sort of philosophical analysis. Both are necessary, I think, right? But that's the Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. That's all I'm saying. The Hadith Jibreel, it's all right there. Right?
No, it's all there. So we'll end it there. Muhammad Khushafa had a good question about, people being isolated. I actually believe, Muhammad, if you raise anybody within a thoroughly Islamic worldview, it will inherently connect you to human beings, because the Prophet ﷺ is al-insanul kamil. He is, there's nothing about his sunnah that is alienating, right? It only seeks to place things in their proper place and perspective. But if one is truly embracing the sunnah, one should not become something enigmatic and incomprehensible to people with albab. Now, if it's just any people, Well, بدأ الإسلام غريبا وفي آخر الزمن سيعود غريبا. Islam began as something strange, and at the end of time it will return to being something strange, but strange in the sense that someone removed from its reality might have a difficult time understanding it, but not strange in the sense that it would become repulsive,
right,
to anyone decent.
Because Islam is the deen al-fitra, it's the religion of the fitra, and the sunnah is the fitra, right? And every human being, the fitra can be corrupted, but it's there. And I would also say to Brother Muhammad, I mean, I'm also not saying, when I say alternative cultural spaces, I'm not saying that we should be isolationist. I think for kids, you know, just like when you plant a seed, you have to protect it until it grows strong enough, right? But then once it grows stronger, you have to expose it to the elements to make it even stronger. Otherwise, it will not be able to withstand. I think, you know, children have to be obviously protected, isolated to a certain degree until the aqidah and the Islamic values and lifestyle are thoroughly, you know, inculcated in them. But then if you take it too far and completely isolate them, and then once they sort of, you know, meet the world, they're not going to know how to handle it, right? And we cannot just wish the world away. So after you get the basis down, you have to, you know, we need to, first of all, like expose ourselves and our children to these ideas. We need to talk about them. We need to know how to think about them and analyze them. At the same time, when we come up with our alternative cultural spaces and productions, it's not just for us, it's for everybody. We are an ummah of da'wah, right? This is not, I always say, Islam is not our religion as Muslims. It is the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is, you know, the mukhatab bihi is all of humanity from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, until the day of judgment, right? Islam is sent, Prophet sent rahmatan lil alameen. Islam is for all of mankind until the day of judgment. It's not our religion, it's Allah's religion. We are merely people who have recognized it as true and who try to, you know, follow it and call people to it. So we have to have our alternative production, but then we come and we invite people, come and look at this. Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this, you know, doesn't this answer some of your questions? Doesn't this help, you know, you live a life that's better than the one you're living now? We need to have the confidence to take that out to people, right? Not to just hunker down and bunker down and that'll never work. That siege mentality.
That's not our model. We're not a civilized community. We've never been an isolationist community or a secessionist community. That's not us.